The nature of air combat over Southeast Asia between 1965 and 1973 was defined not by isolated acts of exceptional courage, but by the repetition of missions that carried inherent risk. Danger was not an anomaly, it was a feature of the operational environment. Crews flew into predictable threats because the mission required it, and they did so day after day until their tour ended or the aircraft did not return. This was not dramatic, it was arithmetic. The air war over North Vietnam, Laos, and South Vietnam demanded different mission profiles, each with specific exposure to ground fire, surface-to-air missiles, and operational failure. Some missions were dangerous because they required sustained presence over contested airspace. Others were dangerous because they demanded low altitude, slow speed, or both. Understanding which missions carried the highest risk requires understanding what made them unavoidable. North Vietnam possessed one of the most concentrated air defense networks ever assembled. By 1967, the combination of radar-guided SA-2 surface-to-air missiles, radar-directed anti-aircraft artillery in the 57mm, 85mm, and 100mm range, and optically aimed guns from 12.7mm to 37mm created overlapping zones of lethality from ground level to above 50,000 feet. The system was not static, it adapted. Missile sites relocated, gun positions multiplied. The North Vietnamese understood American tactics and adjusted their defenses accordingly. Pilots could not avoid this system by flying higher or lower. High altitude exposed them to missiles. Low altitude exposed them to automatic weapons and light flak. Medium altitude exposed them to both. There was no safe corridor. Mission planners could select routes and timing to minimize exposure, but they could not eliminate it. Every sortie into Route Package 6, the area surrounding Hanoi and Haiphong, was a calculated trade between mission necessity and acceptable loss. The most consistently dangerous missions were not the ones that made headlines. They were the ones that required crews to remain exposed, predictable, or both. Close air support missions in South Vietnam and Laos placed aircraft in prolonged contact with ground fire. Tactical reconnaissance required straight-line flight over known defenses. Forward air control demanded slow loitering over active combat zones. Search and rescue missions required aircraft to hold position within range of the forces that had just shot someone down. Each of these missions placed crews in circumstances where enemy gunners had time, opportunity, and geometry on their side. Low-altitude strike missions against bridges, supply depots, and transportation nodes in North Vietnam were especially hazardous because they combined all of the unfavorable conditions at once. The targets were defended. The approach required low altitude to avoid early radar detection and to improve bombing accuracy. The attack run was predictable because the target was fixed, and the exposure time was extended because multiple aircraft had to attack the same target in sequence. A typical strike against a bridge in the southern panhandle of North Vietnam would begin with a flight of 4 F-105 Thunderchiefs approaching at low level, below 500 feet, using terrain and speed to delay detection. The lead aircraft would acquire the target visually, roll into a 30-degree dive, release ordnance, and pull off at minimum altitude to avoid both the ground and the explosion. The second, third, and fourth aircraft would follow the same path, each one telegraphing its approach to every gun crew within range. By the time the fourth aircraft began its run, the gunners knew the altitude, the direction, and the pull-off point. They did not need radar. They needed patience. The F-105 was fast, but it was not maneuverable at low altitude with a full load of fuel and bombs. Once committed to the attack, the pilot had limited ability to deviate. This made the fourth aircraft in a strike package statistically more vulnerable than the first. The gunners had time to adjust. The aircraft itself compounded the problem. The F-105 was designed as a nuclear strike platform capable of supersonic speed at low altitude. It was large, heavy, and built around a single engine. A single hit in the wrong place could cause hydraulic failure, fuel loss, or engine failure, any of which could render the aircraft unflyable. Pilots referred to it as the thud, not out of affection, but because of the sound it made when it hit the ground. By the end of the war, nearly half of all F-105s built had been lost in combat or operational accidents. The majority of those losses occurred during low-altitude strikes in North Vietnam. The missions continued because the bridges had to be dropped and the supply lines had to be cut. Crews understood that the odds were cumulative. A pilot might survive 10 missions, 20 missions, 50 missions, but the probability of loss increased with every sortie. 100 missions over North Vietnam was not evidence of skill alone, it was evidence of statistical survival. Close air support missions in South Vietnam operated under different constraints but comparable danger. The mission required aircraft to deliver ordnance within meters of friendly forces, often in terrain that restricted maneuver and against an enemy that had prepared the engagement area in advance. The forward air controller, usually flying a slow, low-altitude aircraft such as the O-1 Bird Dog or the O-2 Skymaster, would mark the target with smoke rockets and direct the strike aircraft onto the target by radio. The geometry was unfavorable. The strike aircraft, typically an A-1 Skyraider, an F-4 Phantom, or an F-100 Super Sabre, had to approach at an angle that allowed visual acquisition of both the target and the friendly positions. This often required a run-in heading that was predictable and repeated. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces quickly learned to position anti-aircraft weapons along the likely approach corridors. Once the first aircraft began its run, every subsequent pass became progressively more dangerous. The A-1 Skyraider was particularly vulnerable and particularly valuable. It was a propeller-driven attack aircraft designed in the 1940s, obsolete by the standards of the jet age, but uniquely suited to close air support in Southeast Asia. It was slow, with a maximum speed below 300 miles per hour. It could carry an enormous ordnance load, loiter for hours, and operate from short, unimproved runways. Its low speed allowed for precise weapon delivery, but it also meant that the aircraft spent more time within range of ground fire. Skyraider pilots flew at altitudes between 1,000 and 3,000 feet during attack runs, well within the envelope of small arms fire and light automatic weapons. The sound of rounds hitting the airframe was routine. The aircraft could absorb significant damage and continue flying, but the pilot could not. Cockpit hits were common. Many Skyraider pilots flew entire tours with bullet holes in the wings and fuselage of their assigned aircraft, patched between missions and redamaged on the next sortie. The danger was not limited to the attack run. Close air support missions often required multiple passes to achieve the desired effect. The forward air controller would assess the results, request adjustments, and direct another pass. Each pass increased the enemy's ability to track the aircraft and predict its flight path. By the third or fourth pass, gunners on the ground were firing not at where the aircraft was, but where it would be. Night close air support missions eliminated the pilot's ability to see the ground fire, but the ground fire did not stop. Tracer rounds provided some indication of the threat, but most rounds were not tracers. Pilots flew through curtains of fire they could not see, guided only by the forward air controller's instructions and their own instruments. The stress of sustained exposure to invisible threats was cumulative. Pilots reported that night missions over contested areas were mentally exhausting in ways that day missions were not because the danger was greater, but because it was unobservable. Tactical reconnaissance missions required aircraft to fly straight and level over defended areas to obtain usable photography. The RF-4C Phantom and the RF-101 Voodoo carried cameras in the nose, calibrated for specific altitudes and speeds. Deviation from the planned flight path degraded the imagery. This made reconnaissance aircraft predictable and unable to maneuver defensively during the photo run. A typical reconnaissance mission over North Vietnam would involve a single aircraft, sometimes a pair, penetrating defended airspace at high speed and medium altitude. The aircraft would locate the target, stabilize on the photo run heading, and maintain constant altitude and speed for the duration of the camera cycle. This could last anywhere from 10 seconds to over a minute, depending on the target size and the camera settings. During that period, the aircraft was fully committed. Any evasive maneuver would ruin the photography and require another pass. The North Vietnamese Air Defense Network learned to recognize reconnaissance profiles. Missile batteries would wait until the aircraft steadied on the photo run before launching. The SA-2 missile had a flight time of roughly 30 seconds from launch to intercept at medium altitude. A pilot who broke off the photo run immediately upon seeing the missile launch might evade. A pilot who held the run to completion would have less time and less energy to maneuver. The choice was between mission success and survival, and it had to be made in seconds. Reconnaissance pilots understood that the intelligence they gathered was often time-sensitive. A delay of even 1 day could allow the enemy to relocate equipment or reinforce a position. This created pressure to complete the mission regardless of conditions. Pilots flew through weather that grounded other missions. They flew alone, without the mutual support of a strike package. And they flew knowing that a successful mission meant they would be sent back to the same area, over the same defenses, until the target was no longer considered valuable or the aircraft did not return. Forward air control missions represented a different category of sustained exposure. The forward air controller was responsible for locating enemy forces, marking targets, and directing strike aircraft. This required loitering over hostile territory at low altitude and slow speed in aircraft that were minimally armed and highly vulnerable. The O-1 Bird Dog, a single-engine liaison aircraft derived from a civilian design, had a maximum speed of 115 miles per hour and no armor. The O-2 Skymaster, a twin-engine derivative of a civilian aircraft, was slightly faster but equally exposed. Forward air controllers flew visual reconnaissance patterns over areas where enemy forces were suspected or confirmed. They searched for signs of movement, supply caches, or defensive positions. When they found something, they marked it with smoke rockets and called in strike aircraft. This process required them to remain in the area, often for extended periods, while the strike aircraft arrived, received their briefing, conducted their attacks, and departed. During this time, the forward air controller was circling at low altitude within range of anything that could fire upward. The enemy quickly learned to target forward air controllers. Shooting down the FAC disrupted the entire close air support process and removed the only set of eyes guiding strikes in that area. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned specifically to engage slow, low-flying aircraft. The O-1 and O-2 had no warning systems and limited ability to detect threats. Pilots relied on visual observation and experience. They learned to recognize the dust signature of a gun firing, the geometry of tracer patterns, and the sound of rounds passing nearby. Many forward air controllers flew daily missions over the same areas. The enemy learned their patterns, their altitudes, and their tendencies. Some FAC pilots reported being fired upon by the same gun positions repeatedly, mission after mission, in what became a grim routine. The guns could not be suppressed without diverting strike aircraft from other targets, and there were always more guns. The FAC pilots continued flying because the ground units needed them, and there was no alternative method for directing close air support with comparable accuracy. Night missions in Southeast Asia carried additional risk due to the lack of visual reference and the difficulty of navigation over terrain with few identifiable landmarks and unreliable navigation aids. Pilots relied on dead reckoning, radio beacons, and rudimentary radar systems that were often jammed or degraded by weather. Flying at low altitude in these conditions required constant attention to instruments and created opportunities for controlled flight into terrain. Combat missions at night compounded the problem. Pilots had to navigate, avoid defenses, locate the target, deliver weapons, and egress, all without external visual reference. The North Vietnamese did not reduce their defenses at night. In some cases, they increased them, knowing that American pilots had reduced situational awareness. Anti-aircraft artillery equipped with radar direction finders could track aircraft by their emissions and engage without visual contact. The result was that pilots at night were often unaware they were being tracked until the firing began. Bad weather missions were similarly hazardous. The monsoon season brought low cloud cover, heavy rain, and poor visibility that could persist for days. Missions continued because the operational tempo demanded it and because gaps in the weather were unpredictable. Pilots flew under cloud decks that reduced altitude options and forced them into the range of light anti-aircraft weapons. They flew through clouds on instruments, knowing that a navigation error could place them over Hanoi instead of their planned route. The combination of night and weather was the worst condition. Pilots described it as flying inside a dark bag with no reference to the outside world except the instruments and the occasional flash of anti-aircraft fire. Spatial disorientation was common. Several aircraft were lost not to enemy action but to loss of control in instrument conditions. The distinction was academic. The mission required flight in those conditions, and the outcome was the same. Search and rescue missions were among the most dangerous because they required sustained presence over hostile territory in defense of a single individual. When an aircraft was shot down, the crew's survival depended on rapid extraction. Rescue helicopters, primarily the HH-3 Jolly Green Giant and later the HH-53 Super Jolly Green Giant, would penetrate enemy territory, locate the survivor, and attempt a pickup while under fire. The helicopters were large, slow, and minimally armed. They required escort and suppression support from fixed-wing aircraft, usually A-1 Skyraiders, which themselves became targets. The rescue process was predictable. The downed pilot's emergency beacon provided a location. The rescue forces would converge on that location, and so would the enemy. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong quickly learned to use downed pilots as bait, positioning anti-aircraft weapons around the likely pickup zone and waiting for the rescue attempt. The rescue forces understood this, but they came anyway, because leaving a pilot behind was not an option. The A-1 Skyraiders that escorted the rescue helicopters known as Sandies would arrive first and attempt to suppress ground fire. They would strafe suspected gun positions, drop ordnance on known threats, and lay down smoke to obscure the helicopter's approach. This required them to fly low and slow in a highly contested area, often for extended periods. The longer the rescue took, the more time the enemy had to reposition and reinforce. The helicopters themselves were exposed throughout the entire pickup sequence. They had to slow to a hover, lower a penetrator or deploy a rescue specialist, and wait while the survivor was secured. During this time, the helicopter was stationary and vulnerable. Door gunners provided suppressive fire, but the volume of fire they could deliver was limited. If the helicopter took damage to the engines, transmission, or flight controls, it would crash in the same area, creating a second rescue problem. Many rescue missions required multiple attempts. The first helicopter might be driven off by ground fire, the second might reach the survivor but take damage and be forced to abort. A successful rescue often required hours of sustained effort, numerous attack runs by the escorts, and the commitment of additional resources. The cost in aircraft and crew could exceed the value of a single rescue, but the calculation was not made in those terms. The commitment to rescue was absolute, and the enemy exploited that commitment. Wild Weasel missions, flown primarily by F-105F and later F-4G aircraft, were designed to locate and destroy surface-to-air missile sites. The mission required the crew to provoke the missile battery into activating its radar, detect the emissions, identify the location, and attack before the missile launched or the radar shut down. This meant flying into known missile engagement zones and deliberately presenting a target. The tactics were straightforward but unforgiving. The Wild Weasel crew would enter defended airspace and wait for an SA-2 radar to lock on. The electronic warfare officer in the back seat would identify the radar type and provide the pilot with bearing and range. The pilot would then maneuver to attack the site, either with anti-radiation missiles that homed on the radar emissions or with conventional bombs. The difficulty was that the SA-2 site would often launch a missile as soon as it achieved lock, giving the crew only seconds to react. Evading an SA-2 missile required the pilot to see the launch, estimate the intercept point, and execute a high-G defensive maneuver at the precise moment the missile committed to its terminal trajectory. Too early, and the missile would adjust. Too late, and the proximity fuse would detonate the warhead close enough to destroy the aircraft. The margin was small, and the pilot had no second chance. Wild Weasel crews flew repeated missions into the same heavily defended areas because the missile sites were a prerequisite threat for all other missions. Suppressing the SAM network allowed strike packages to operate with reduced risk. The Wild Weasels accepted higher risk to reduce risk for others. The loss rate reflected that trade. By the end of the war, Wild Weasel crews had some of the highest loss rates of any mission specialty. Iron Hand missions, a similar concept flown by Navy and Marine Corps aircraft, involved the suppression of enemy air defenses in support of strike packages. The mission was less focused on destruction and more focused on forcing the radars to shut down, either through the threat of anti-radiation missiles or through direct attack. The result was the same. Aircraft had to enter defended airspace and remain there long enough to pose a credible threat. The enemy responded with missiles, gunfire, and evasive tactics. The Iron Hand aircraft absorbed that response so the strike package could proceed. The sustained nature of the air war meant that crews flew the same dangerous missions repeatedly. A pilot assigned to a squadron flying close air support in South Vietnam might fly 200 missions over the course of a year, each one involving exposure to ground fire. A Wild Weasel crew in Thailand might fly 70 missions over North Vietnam, each one involving direct engagement with the air defense network. The cumulative risk was substantial, and the psychological toll was measurable. Crews understood the statistics. They knew the loss rates for their mission type and their aircraft. They knew which targets had the highest defenses and which routes were most dangerous. They flew anyway, not because they were reckless, but because the mission required it, and because they trusted that their training, their aircraft, and their tactics gave them a chance. The danger of air operations over Southeast Asia was not defined by single events or extraordinary circumstances. It was defined by repetition, exposure, and the inevitability of engagement with a prepared and adaptive enemy. The missions that carried the highest risk were not the ones that involved the greatest speed or the highest altitude. They were the ones that required sustained presence, predictable flight paths, and repeated exposure to overlapping defenses. The crews who flew them did so day after day, understanding that survival was not guaranteed, but that the mission could not be abandoned. That was the nature of the air war, and it continued until the last sortie was flown. Subscribe if you don't want to miss out the next story.